For hundreds of years, Hispanic people have lived in what is now the United States. They helped colonize the Great Southwest. They shaped key pieces of what we consider American culture. And they are one of the fastest growing groups of people in the country. Yet, the American spirit has a complicated past with Hispanic people, filled with conflict over religion, riches, and race. Vast stretches of this country belonged to the Spanish long before they were part of the U.S. The 1800s saw violent battles for land. Even now, our southern border is full of tension. And, through the years, both the U.S. and Mexico have built walls. When I was a child, our nation's Hispanic heritage was never taught to me. I was told the natives of this land were gone, a small number of people were black, and everyone else in America was white. Today, many Hispanics feel their ancestors have been forgotten, and they get treated like foreign invaders who threaten to destroy the American way of life, even though their history here stretches back for centuries. As a white Christian pastor, I want my children to celebrate all people. So I took my family on a road trip through Spanish Texas, the southern border, and a modern-day Hispanic community to explore America and its ancestors. Everyone got comfortable for 2 full days of driving, and we headed 1,000 miles to the south. San Antonio is an old Spanish town with a lot of charm. The Alamo was not quite as big as we expected, but it was a thrill to be in a place with such a storied past. We met a conquistador outside the Spanish governor's palace. We took a break from the southern heat on the steps of the San Fernando Cathedral. We hopped onto one of San Antonio's famous riverboats. Floating through the heart of the city, the narrow canals gave us a unique perspective of the town. We crisscrossed back and forth between colonial and modern times, and were given a first-hand look at the Spanish invasion. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Funded by Catholic rulers and sailing under the flag of Spain, Columbus was searching for a water route to India. Instead, he landed on an island in the Bahamas, where local natives helped dock his ship and bring his crew ashore. Despite the fact that the island was already inhabited, Columbus claimed the land for Spain. Soon, Spanish Catholics began to convert the natives to Christianity by force. They required natives to pay their new conquerors tributes of gold. They abducted native men, women, and children to sell into slavery. During this period, Columbus's idea of Christian conquest was not unusual. In fact, it was common for Spanish Catholics to believe God wanted them to spread their religion through war, to take wealth for themselves along the way, and to violate the basic human rights of people who were not a part of their culture. However, Spain mostly stopped short of the British approach of wiping out natives and their cultures entirely. The Spanish looked for ways to live alongside the natives, and even began to intermarry with them, as well as with people who came to the Americas from different regions. The families and communities created by these relationships grew into a mix of Spanish and other cultures. Today, white people refer to these cultures as Hispanic. But there is not really any such thing as a single Hispanic culture that unifies people from all of the Spanish colonies. Instead, there are multiple local Hispanic cultures, each with their own distinct history.
We were a mixture of different races, African, indigenous, and Hispanic. Most of us prefer to go by what our individual ethnicity is. I'm Mexican American. And in the case of Mexican Americans, much of our background is indigenous. We're native peoples of this continent. We're peoples who didn't come from anywhere other than the Americas. And we have a little bit of Spanish blood mixed in there.
For 300 years, New Spain spread north from Mexico City all the way up to northern Texas. On the east side of Texas, New Spain set up 5 missions, which were small communities where native tribes were invited to live for protection. Catholic priests taught the natives Spanish, as well as skills such as farming, masonry, and blacksmithing. Though everyone lived within the same walls at the missions, there were often serious divisions between the people. Natives were frequently considered an inferior race. They were required to do the hardest tasks. And they were forced to declare allegiance to the Catholic Church. In the end, the complexity of cultures and the hot, dry climate of the area proved too difficult, so the missions were moved closer to San Antonio.
The Franciscans' role here was, number one, to help the Native Americans become good Christians, to evangelize them, make them good Catholics, but also make them good Spanish citizens. What worked in the past? What didn't work in the past? What lessons can we learn? If we better understand our history, we can better understand who we are today.
From 1492 to the early 1800s, Spain extended its empire throughout the Americas, converting people to Catholicism, claiming gold and land for the crown, and creating new cultures. During this time, the exact boundaries of Spanish territory changed constantly, as other European countries also sought to expand, and fought with each other about who should get to steal what land. By the year 1821, the Spanish invasion had led to millions of miles of colonized land. If New Spain had built a border wall, it would have stretched from California to Texas. In San Antonio, the history of Spanish Texas is easy to find. 4 of the old Catholic missions are now maintained by the National Park Service and open to the public. At Mission Concepcion, we met National Park Ranger Jorge Hernandez, who agreed to give us a private tour through the sites. The missions were built with walls around the outside to protect the people within. Inside the walls, there were large plazas, wells, and, of course, a church. We wandered down arched corridors. We marveled at the stone construction. Lori took time to stop and smell the flowers. Jorge immediately became my favorite park ranger when we came to a closed gate, and he promptly showed us the easiest way to cross. The path led us down to the Mission Espada Aqueduct. Built by natives and used to channel water between the missions, this is the oldest aqueduct in the nation that has been in continuous use.
It's easy to imagine families gathering in this very spot centuries ago. I think I would have spent all of my time here, because Texas is hot.
The San Antonio mission structures take you back in time with their Spanish charm. For some people, remains like these have led to a romantic opinion of the Spanish past, and they have become a sign of simpler times. In reality, Spanish colonial times were anything but simple. From religion to riches to race, Spanish Catholics built many walls between themselves and the natives. Still, these sites preserve the history of Spanish and native cultures beginning to live together.
The story that we preserve, or the things that we preserve, is not only the structures that you can come and see, which are really beautiful, but also the stories of the first people that live here, both indigenous and Spanish.
As the sun set on the horizon, we said goodbye to the old stone walls and set out to find a newer wall. Laredo, Texas is located on the U.S. southern border and has been claimed by 7 different countries. Known as the City of 7 Flags, the town takes pride in its ties to multiple nations. Due to its easy access to imports from the South, it is also known for low-price shopping. So we decided Lori and Lily needed clothes more suited to the last stop before the Rio Grande. We visited a museum that celebrates the town's rich past. Border towns like this represent the coming together of various cultures. When you look closely at them, you discover surprising ways your own culture has been shaped through generations. For example, the cowboy image so many people associate with white Americans today was actually inspired by Tejanos, who are one of the oldest Hispanic cultures in Texas.
The first ranches in Texas were by Tejanos. Tejanos are at the core of the American Southwest. Their culture is part of what makes that melting pot today in America.
Mexico's cowboy culture rode into view when we stepped inside the Border Heritage Museum, which was displaying a fun collection of old Mexican cowboy movie posters. Mary Ellen used the film titles to test her 4 years of high school Spanish.
The Immortal Cowboy. The Black Cowboy of the North. The Cowboy and the Lady.
Once we tore ourselves away from the Cowboy Museum, we learned Laredo has a laid-back vibe. With a 98% Hispanic population and obvious Spanish influences, this border town feels a lot like Mexico. And, at one point, it was. In 1821, New Spain issued a Declaration of Independence to become Mexico. But the new country struggled to secure its northern border. White Americans had begun to illegally cross into East Texas, where the climate was perfect for cotton. Worried the invaders were going to take their land and destroy their culture, Mexico passed legislation to slow the waves of illegal aliens coming from the north. It turned out Mexico had good reason to be afraid. White American Protestants were beginning to have their own vision of Christian conquest. Popular images of Hispanic people painted them as savage criminals who were an intellectually inferior race because they mixed with natives. Supporters of slavery made plans to admit Texas as a new slave state. And Protestant clergy preached sermons on how it was their manifest destiny to claim the American West. The idea that the United States should take the Southwest because God ordained it was later captured in the popular painting, American Progress. The painting shows the spirit of progress majestically floating to the west, leading the way for white settlers while natives and wild animals flee from their presence.
The Bible was manipulated in the interest of manifest destiny because it was a message that was proclaimed from pulpits and taught in Sunday schools and written up in church periodicals on the basis that moving westward would, quote, Christianize or re-Christianize the continent. That period in our history was not helpful. I know we can do better.
In 1829, Mexico made progress of its own by abolishing slavery. which put them in direct conflict with the economic interests of the South. Soon, white slaveholders in Texas declared their independence from Mexico to form the Republic of Texas, which the U.S. later welcomed as a new slave state. But Texas was not the end of U.S. expansion. The United States wanted to buy the Southwest from Mexico, but Mexico declined. With war as the only option to take the land we wanted, the U.S. invaded Mexico. Almost 2 years later, the U.S. claimed more than half of Mexico's land, including every single mile Mexico had refused to sell. In Texas, some border towns have now changed hands almost too many times to count. But the changing border brought more than just new flags to the people of the Southwest. At the end of the Mexican-American War, around 80,000 Mexican citizens suddenly lived in the United States. And the white Protestants who had longed to expand their territory did not always know what to do with the Hispanics who already lived there.
People ask me, when did you cross the border? I said, I didn't cross the border. They said, when did your parents cross the border? I said, they didn't cross the border. When did your grandparents cross the border? They didn't cross the border. We didn't cross the border crossed us.
In the early 1900s, the idea of building border walls in certain cities was proposed by both the U.S. and Mexico. Walls were intended to be a way to curb smuggling in either direction, as well as track movement between the two countries, and were based on the premise that fences make good neighbors. These walls were all designed to secure the land that was taken in the U.S. invasion of Mexico. Today, it is the American border that stretches from Texas to California. Here in Laredo, the U.S. and Mexico interact on a daily basis. But I could not help but notice how casual the people here are about crossing the border. In my mind, I had always envisioned the Rio Grande being a giant natural barrier dividing the U.S. from Mexico. But when you see it up close, it is really quite small. So the people who live in Laredo do not call it the Rio Grande. They call it El Charco, or the Puddle.
Looking at the river from here, I could totally swim that.
Around here, another part of daily life is immigration. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people try to migrate north to the United States. Many cross with documents, while others try to enter illegally. Another 100,000 come to seek asylum. Most asylum seekers are fleeing extreme poverty, or the corruption of drug cartels who are moving north to get closer to their biggest customer. We wanted to meet people who were in the legal process of seeking asylum, so we visited the Holding Institute. This community center provides a place to stay for immigrants while they navigate the asylum process. The Institute does everything they can to make residents feel comfortable in their temporary home.
I see Christ's face, I see his work, I see his hands, I see it daily in the people that we serve. They're taking jobs that probably no one else wants. Service industry, labor jobs, low wages, long hours, that's what they're willing to do. Because even at that level, it represents opportunity for their families and for their children.
On cool mornings, clothes dry in the breeze. People sit outside in the courtyard. Children play sports. Lily welcomed some of the kids to America by beating them in a game of basketball. While we were there, an immigrant volunteered to talk to us about why he chose to come to our country.
Pero si me dieran la oportunidad, mis sueños, mis anhelos es en el nombre de Dios primero comprar allá un terreno de mi familia, construir mi casita donde vivamos yo y mi familia.
We could have stayed at the Holding Institute for days. But it was time to leave the border wall and see what Hispanic life is like closer to home. In Hamilton, Ohio, we met with Pastor Edinson DeArco. Hamilton is called the City of Sculpture for its dozens of historic and artistic statues. There were elephants, a boy and his dog, cats on a bench, Jesus in a cage, and, of course, the namesake of the town, Alexander Hamilton himself, one of our nation's founding fathers, and an immigrant from the West Indies. On the south side of town, there is a log cabin replica to celebrate pioneers who migrated here in the 1800s. The statue of a pioneer family was missing, so we had to improvise. The town's tribute to pioneers is a salute to early white immigrants. But not everyone in Hamilton continues to celebrate immigrants today. Over the last 150 years, the physical border between the U.S. and Mexico has been increasingly secured. But the cultural border has been constantly changing. Across America, the evidence of our nation's Spanish past is everywhere to be found. Spanish names grace cities from San Antonio to Los Angeles. Hispanic festivals like Dia de Muertos are celebrated throughout the country. Mexican restaurants can be found in urban centers and small towns, with varying degrees of authenticity. Since 1970, our Hispanic population has doubled 3 times. Many white people have become alarmed by the rise in numbers, and are afraid of what they call the Hispanic invasion. Here in the Americas, with the Spanish Catholic and American Protestant past of actual violent invasions, I think it is a bit of a stretch to associate a rise in population with war, land theft, or racial conflict. But the fear of Hispanic people destroying American culture is very real, and it has given new life to old stereotypes.
Some of the misconceptions that always happen about Hispanics is that we're lazy, that we're foreigners, that we don't want to be involved in American society or learn English, that we are somehow just wanting to be given a handout, and that we are prone to be immoral and use a lot of drugs. Let me think, what have I left out?
The fear of Hispanic invaders can be felt far north of the border. In the small Midwestern city of Hamilton, Ohio, 15% of the area's economy is based on manufacturing, which has begun to attract Hispanic workers. Many of the white people who live in Hamilton are afraid their town will be destroyed by their new neighbors. But when you sit down with actual immigrants, the false stereotypes about them give way to harsh realities.
We are not dangerous. This is poor community that come here to try to find something for the families. They are honest. They are not try to steal. They try to work to get the money to pay for something that they need. This is different. And now the stereotype that you are dangerous. No, that's not true. That's not true.
The truth is, the vast majority of immigrants are more likely to be fleeing crime than bringing it. They are more likely to be escaping drug cartels than working for them. And they are more likely to work hard labor for low wages than to collect a government check. Many of them risk everything they have to try to build a better life. Even so, The fact that immigration gets so much attention in the national conversation about Hispanics makes it easy to forget that only a fraction of the Hispanic people in the United States have actually come from another country. Today, there are around 8 million undocumented Hispanic immigrants in America. But that is only 13% of the nearly 60 million Hispanics who live in the country. Hispanics make up 18% of the U.S. population. 17% of our workforce is Hispanic. 18% of the U.S. military is Hispanic. 19% of our country's Christians are Hispanic. Hispanic people live in every state of the nation. And fully 40 million of our Hispanic citizens have been born inside the United States.
We have benefited from the wealth and the hard work and labors of people from those regions. I urge our local churches and colleagues in ministry to gather with people whose history is rooted in Latin America and to share their stories of their journeys. That would go a long way to better understanding.
In spite of the physical and symbolic walls designed to keep them out of American life, tens of millions of Hispanic people continue to build their futures here. A vast majority of the Hispanic people who live here are Christians. They work hard to support themselves. They sacrifice everything for their families. Their ancestors have deep roots in the Americas. It is true that our nation's Hispanic population is growing. But that is only alarming if you believe there is something wrong with Hispanic people. In the last 50 years, the Hispanic population has been one of the fastest growing groups of people in the United States. Still, it would be hard for Hispanic people to invade U.S. culture, because they have already long been a part of it. Back in Hamilton, we drove through well-manicured streets. We passed by the lines of factories, stretching out in some places for as far as the eye can see. Then we entered the Hispanic side of town, and imagined what life is like for the people who live in these houses. Pastor Edinson invited us to join him for a Bible study. The group gathered in one of the members' homes, where they sang songs to praise God. Then they read the Bible, though most of them did it on their phones. I asked them what their faith means to them.
Por muchos años, hasta hace por 8 años que comencé a ir a la iglesia metodista donde está el pastor. Y gracias a él y a su esposa pude crecer, pude conocer a Cristo.
Nuestras creencias, pues se da esa hermandad, esa familiaridad. De ahí que los miembros de la iglesia se convierten en nuestra familia, nuestros hermanos.
They come to us, and thanks to them, we just felt like we were home. They took care of us. They would literally do anything for us.
After listening to people from the Bible study talk about their faith, I began to wonder why so many Americans are so afraid of their neighbors. So I got permission to film an ordinary day in the life of a family from the church, to see if Hispanic people really are as scary as some people think. Early in the morning, I started my surveillance outside. As the day wore on, I began to suspect this family was not quite as dangerous as Hispanic stereotypes would have me to believe. I asked Rooney what she would want people to know about their Hispanic neighbors.
Get to know us. Don't just see people as less. Because at the end, we're all going to the same place.
I told my wife it was safe to come, and she brought the girls for a visit. Rooney showed Mary Ellen how to cook one of her favorite Honduran meals. Lori and Lily played in the girls' room.
These are fritas. You can put the beans on top, or you can put it separate.
When dinner was ready, we all lined up to fill our plates. Several years ago, Rooney and Samir got legal papers to come to America. They sacrificed their old lives to come build a better one for their family. They embody the hard work ethic that has built this country. They are United Methodist Protestant Christians. They will never be white. But to me, I would say they are about as American as you can get.
We make such a big deal about Central Americans being different from us, but their house is just as crazy as our house.
Not far from Hamilton, the city of Dayton has an annual Dia de Muertos festival. So, a few months after we visited their home, we met back up with Samir and Rooney. By that time, we both had new additions to the family. At the festival, we witnessed our nation's Hispanic heritage firsthand. Dia de Muertos, which means Day of the Dead, is a combination of Native and Catholic traditions to honor and reunite with ancestors who have passed on. Dia de Muertos is a celebration of ancestors. Instead of forgetting the people of the past, it calls on us to remember who we are, where we come from, the families we are a part of, and the people who have journeyed with us on our way. I think that's pretty good advice for our nation today. At the end of the festival, we began the return trip home. This journey took us all the way down to the border to learn about our nation's Hispanic heritage. We visited old Catholic missions and saw our country's Spanish past. We played games with immigrants waiting for asylum and witnessed the coming together of cultures on the border. We spent a day with a Hispanic family and discovered they were not really scary at all. Over the course of the last 500 years, both Spanish Catholics and white Protestants have built more than their fair share of walls. But we also share 5 centuries of history. Through that time, our religions, riches, and races have become intertwined. After all, much of this country was controlled by the Spanish before it was part of the United States. Hispanic people helped colonize the American West. They inspired American legends. They are a critical part of our economy. Our nation would be poorer without them. Every time I sat down with a Hispanic person and listened to their story, common stereotypes about savage criminals just felt foolish. There is no threat of the Hispanic people I met destroying the American way of life. When you take the time to get to know them, they represent some of the greatest values of the American spirit. It is past time for us to stop seeing each other as invaders and begin to celebrate our common ancestors. But first, we will need to tear down our walls.